Nobody in Caldera Falls paid much attention to the man who rode in on a brown mare with a loose shoe and a saddlebag that looked like it had survived a flood. That was, perhaps, exactly what he was counting on. He gave his name as Samuel Reed at the boarding house on Millward Street. Mrs. Gentry, who ran the place and knew everyone's business before they knew it themselves, looked him over once, took in the worn collar, the sun-cracked boots, the quiet way he held his hat, and decided he was nobody worth remembering. She charged him the weekly rate, handed him a key, and went back to her pot of stew. Without another word. Samuel Reed, not Harrington, not the name on the land deed stretching across 3 counties to the east, not the name that made bank clerks straighten their backs and ranch foremen clear their throats. Just Reed, plain and forgettable as creek water. He had chosen it on the ride over. Caldera Falls was the kind of town that looked tired, even on its best days. The main street held a general store, a feed shop, a small church with a leaning steeple, and a saloon that did more business than all the others combined. The ranches surrounding it were mostly small operations, families who had worked the same soil for 20 years and had just enough to keep going, and not quite enough to breathe easy. Samuel had ridden through towns like this before. He had owned pieces of towns like this before, though he preferred not to think about that too long. He had come to Caldera Falls for one reason, and that reason had a name. He had first heard of Selina Harrell 3 months ago at a land auction in Dobbs County. He had not met her there. She had not been there. But her name had come up the way names sometimes do, sideways in conversation, almost by accident. 2 ranchers were talking near the water trough, while Samuel stood close enough to hear without trying. One of them mentioned a woman running the old Harrell spread alone since her father passed. The other one said she was about the stubbornest, most capable woman in the territory. Then the first one laughed and said any man who went courting her had better arrive without a fortune, because Selina Harrell had watched too many wealthy men squeeze the life out of this land and the people on it. Samuel had gone quiet after that. He was not entirely sure what made him turn his horse west 3 weeks later. He told himself it was curiosity. He was reasonably certain that was not the whole truth. He found the Harrell Ranch on his second morning in town, following directions from the boy who swept out the feed shop. It sat about 2 miles past the North Road, a modest spread of fenced pasture, a weathered barn, a main house that had clearly been repaired in sections over many years. The fence line along the east pasture was sagging in 2 places. The water trough near the barn had a slow leak someone had patched with river clay. The whole place had the look of something held together by will more than resources. He stood at the gate for a moment before he heard her. "If you're selling something, the answer is no." She came around the side of the barn with a coil of wire over one shoulder and a pair of work gloves tucked under her arm. She was not what he had pictured, though he could not have said afterward exactly what he had pictured. She was tall for a woman of that era, with dark hair pinned back practically, and a look on her face that suggested she had already made 3 decisions before breakfast and was working on a 4th. She looked at him the way Mrs. Gentry had, a quick, practical assessment, but her eyes stayed a moment longer, like she was reading something she hadn't expected to find. "I'm not selling anything," Samuel said. "I heard you might need a hand." Selina Harrell set the wire coil down against the fence post and pulled on her gloves. "Who told you that?" "Boy at the feed shop." She looked past him briefly toward the road, then back. "That boy tells half the town my business before I've had my morning coffee." She studied him again. "You done ranch work before?" "Enough," he said, which was not entirely a lie. He had overseen ranches. He had simply never worked one. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was actually a series of calculations running behind steady eyes. "I can't pay much," she said finally. "I'm not asking for much," he said, which was, of all the things he had said so far, the most honest. He started the next morning. The work was harder than he had anticipated, and he had anticipated it being hard. Fence repair, water hauling, mucking out the barn, checking the herd. His hands blistered by midday, and he said nothing about it. His back ached by evening, and he said nothing about that either. Selina watched him the way you watch a new horse, not unkindly, but without sentiment. She corrected him twice in the first hour, plainly and without apology. He appreciated that more than she would have understood. By the end of the third day, she stopped watching him quite so closely, which he took as the first real progress he had made. They did not talk much those first days. She was not unfriendly. She brought coffee out at mid-morning and asked practical questions about the work, but she was contained. There was a boundary around her that was not hostility. It was more like the result of having learned, slowly and repeatedly, that depending on other people cost more than it saved. He recognized it because he had built a version of it himself. It was on the fifth evening, when they were both leaning against the pasture fence, watching a lame calf that had refused water all day, that she first said something that had nothing to do with the ranch. "You're not what I expected," she said. Not warmly, just as a fact she had arrived at and decided to say out loud. "What did you expect?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. Men who show up asking for work usually want something else underneath it. Samuel looked at the calf. Maybe some of them just need somewhere to be for a while. She turned to look at him then, and he made the mistake, or perhaps it was not a mistake, of meeting her eyes. "Maybe," she said. And then she pushed off the fence and walked back toward the house, and Samuel stood there in the cooling air of early evening, understanding, with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable, that he had already made this considerably more complicated than he had planned. The calf drank water that night. Selina came out to check on it before bed and found Samuel still there, sitting quietly on an overturned pail in the dark. She didn't tell him to go in. She just sat down on the fence rail above him, and they watched the calf together without saying a word. That was the moment, though neither of them knew it yet, that something between them shifted, quietly, irreversibly, like a door that opens an inch and can never quite close the same way again. What Samuel did not know was that inside the house, in a letter sitting unopened on Selina's kitchen table, was a name. A real one, and it was going to find him whether he was ready or not. The letter had come addressed to the Harrell Ranch, which made no sense to Selina until she read it. It was from a land attorney in Dobbs County, a man named Percival Cobb, and it was politely worded in the way that expensive lawyers are polite when they want something. He was writing, he said, on behalf of a client with significant interest in the land surrounding Caldera Falls. His client was prepared to make generous offers to any willing sellers in the area. He hoped Miss Harrell would consider a meeting at her earliest convenience. Selina folded the letter, set it on the table, and went back outside. She had received letters like this before, not from Cobb specifically, but from men like him. Smooth-toned representatives of larger interests who arrived ahead of the money like outriders before a cavalry. She knew what came after the polite letters. She had watched it happen to 3 ranching families in this valley alone. The Sorensens had sold under pressure and moved east. The Glovers had held out until their water access was quietly cut off, and they had no choice. Old Henry Baggett had refused until the day he died, and his children had sold the week after the funeral. Her father had watched all of it from this porch, and she had watched it beside him. She was not selling. Samuel noticed the shift in her mood without asking about it. She was sharper at the edges that morning, not toward him exactly, but toward everything. The way she set tools down, the way she answered the 2 ranch hands who came by looking for part-time work and left without being hired. He kept his head down and worked. By afternoon, they were repairing the east fence line together, and the silence between them had changed texture from the comfortable kind to the kind that means someone is thinking hard about something they haven't decided to say yet. "Someone trying to buy you out?" he asked finally, not looking up from the wire he was stretching. She glanced at him sideways. "Why would you ask that?" "You've been quiet in a specific way since this morning." She considered that for a moment, seemed to decide it was a fair observation rather than an intrusion. "Letter from an attorney. Client wants to make offers on land around here." Samuel kept his hands moving. "You going to meet with him?" "No." The word had no heat in it. It was simply the end of the matter as far as she was concerned. He nodded and said nothing more, and she seemed to appreciate that. The not pushing, the letting it be what it was. Most men she had known had an opinion about her decisions before she finished explaining them. What Samuel did not say. In that moment against the fence line with the late afternoon light going gold across the pasture was that he knew the name Percival Cobb. Knew it well, in fact. Cobb was not acting on behalf of some anonymous client. He was acting on behalf of the Harrington Land Holdings, Samuel's own family's legal office, still operating under his name and his instructions. Still pursuing the quiet land consolidation strategy Samuel had set in motion 18 months ago, before he had ridden west and complicated everything by becoming a different version of himself. He had forgotten about Caldera Falls being on that list, or perhaps he had not let himself remember. He finished the fence line in silence and spent the rest of the evening in a state of careful, controlled stillness that a person who did not know him might have mistaken for calm. The following Sunday, Selina went to church and Samuel did not. It was not that he had anything against the practice. It was that 3 of the largest landowners in the county attended that church, and he had met 2 of them before, under his real name, at a cattleman's dinner in Amarillo. The risk was not worth it. Instead, he stayed at the ranch and fixed the leak in the water trough properly, not with river clay, but with fitted timber and iron banding, the way it should have been done originally. When Selina returned and saw it, she stopped and looked at the trough for a long moment. "I didn't ask you to do that," she said. "I know," he said. Another pause. "That kind of iron banding isn't cheap. I had some coin set aside," he said, which was the most absurd sentence he had ever spoken in his life, given that his personal accounts held more money than this entire county would see in a decade. But she accepted it with a small nod and moved on, and he was grateful she did not look at him too closely in that moment. It was around this time that the town began to form an opinion about Samuel Reed. Small towns form opinions the way rivers form banks, slowly, then all at once. The general consensus in Caldera Falls was that he was a decent, quiet, hard-working man of modest means who seemed genuinely attached to the Harrell Ranch. Mrs. Gentry said he was the kind of man who didn't make problems, which was her highest compliment. The boy from the feed shop had apparently told half the street that Samuel had given him his leftover biscuit from lunch one afternoon, which had elevated his reputation considerably among the younger population. The opinion that mattered most, though, was forming in a quieter place. Selina did not speak about it, but she started leaving the coffee out longer in the mornings. She asked his opinion once about the lame calf, which had recovered fully and was now causing trouble in the south pasture, and listened to what he said with the kind of attention she usually reserved for information she intended to use. One evening she laughed at something he said, a real laugh, short and unguarded, and then looked slightly surprised at herself for it. Samuel noticed all of it and said nothing, because the situation was already more complicated than he deserved, and adding pressure would only have been selfish. The problem arrived on a Wednesday, which felt like the wrong day for problems. Samuel was at the far end of the north pasture when he saw the rider come up the main road toward the ranch. He didn't recognize the horse, but he recognized the posture, the particular upright ease of a man who had never worried about the cost of a good saddle. He walked back toward the barn slowly, watching. The man tied his horse at the gate and knocked at the front door of the house. Selina answered. They spoke for several minutes on the porch. Samuel could not hear the words from where he stood, but he could see the way Selina's posture changed. Arms crossing, weight shifting back, chin lifting slightly, the body language of a woman holding a door partially closed. The man handed her something, an envelope or perhaps a card, and tipped his hat and left. Samuel waited until the rider was back on the road before he walked toward the house. Selina was still on the porch, looking at whatever the man had given her. "Who was that?" Samuel asked. She held up a small card between two fingers. "Percival Cobb," she said. "In the flesh." Samuel kept his expression exactly where it was. It required more effort than it should have. "He came out personally?" he said. "Said his client is very motivated." She looked at the card a moment longer, then set it on the porch railing with the particular stillness of someone choosing not to throw something. "He also said his client has recently been in the territory himself, personally scouting properties." The air between them felt suddenly thinner. "Did he say who the client was?" Samuel asked. Selina looked at him. Not suspicious, not yet, but with that reading something unexpected look she had given him that first morning at the gate. "Harrington," she said. "Samuel Harrington." She watched his face as she said it, and for the first time since he had ridden into Caldera Falls on a mare with a loose shoe, Samuel did not have an answer ready. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it was the wrong kind of silence, the kind that has a shape to it, that a perceptive person can read like a change in weather. Selina was a perceptive person. "You've heard the name," she said. Not a question. "Most people in the territory have," Samuel said. Which was true, and which was also the most carefully constructed non-answer he had ever produced. She looked at him a moment longer, then turned and went inside. He stood on the porch and let out a slow breath and understood that he had perhaps 2 days, maybe 3, before something else arrived to finish what Cobb had started. A follow-up letter, another visit, or worse, someone who knew his face. He went back to work because there was nothing else to do, and because the work, at least, was honest. That evening, Selina made supper for both of them, which she did perhaps twice a week, when the day had been long and the work shared. It was a practical arrangement she had arrived at without much ceremony, and Samuel had accepted it the same way. They ate mostly in silence, the good kind, usually. Tonight it had a question in it. She poured coffee after the plates were cleared, and sat back down, and looked at him across the table with the directness she brought to everything. "What do you know about Harrington?" she asked. Samuel wrapped both hands around his cup. "What have you heard about him?" "I asked first," she said. Quietly, but firmly. He looked at the coffee, then at her. She deserved better than another deflection. He knew that. He had known it for some time, if he was being truthful with himself. The problem was that the truth had grown roots in the wrong season, and pulling it up now would disturb everything around it. "I've heard he's a man who built a lot of wealth quickly," Samuel said carefully, "and that he doesn't always think about what gets flattened in the process." Selina was quiet for a moment. "That's a generous description. I'm trying to be fair." "Fair," she repeated, like she was testing the weight of the word. "My father spent 30 years building this ranch. Men like Harrington spend 30 minutes deciding it's an asset worth acquiring." She looked at her cup. "I don't hate wealth, you understand. I've known decent people with money. It's a specific kind of man I can't abide. The kind who looks at a piece of land and sees a number instead of someone's life." Samuel said nothing. There was nothing to say that wasn't either a lie or a confession, and he wasn't ready for the confession. Not yet. He told himself not yet. He had almost settled on telling her the next morning. He had rehearsed it in the dark of his room at Mrs. Gentry's boarding house. The straightforward version, the one that started with "My name is not Reed," and ended with "I came here because I wanted one person to know me without knowing what I was worth." He had rehearsed the part where she would be angry, and the part where he would not make excuses, and the part where he would give her time. He had not rehearsed the part where she found out from someone else first. The man's name was Donald Pearson. He was Samuel's former land manager, recently dismissed for reasons that had nothing to do with Caldera Falls, and he had apparently decided that the territory was small enough to make coincidences of the humiliating kind. He rode in on a Thursday morning and spotted Samuel crossing the main street near the general store. "Mr. Harrington," he called out, loud enough to turn 3 heads. "Samuel Harrington. I thought that was you." Samuel stopped walking. Pearson pulled his horse up and looked down with the particular satisfaction of a man who feels he has been wronged and has accidentally found an opportunity. "Didn't expect to find you out here playing ranch hand," he said, loud enough still. "Does anyone here know who you—" "Pearson," Samuel said, quietly, the way you say a word when you want it to stop something. But the damage had a different timeline than the warning. Across the street, coming out of the general store with a paper-wrapped parcel under one arm, Selina Harrell stopped walking. She did not come to him. She went home. Samuel let Pearson ride on without another word and stood in the middle of the street for a moment, and then he walked to the Harrell ranch because there was no version of this that got better with waiting. She was at the fence when he arrived, not working, just standing there with her hands resting on the top rail, looking out at the pasture. He had learned enough about her by now to know that this was where she went when she needed to think without being watched. He stopped a few feet away and didn't lean on the fence. "Selina," he said. "Don't," she said, not angrily, with a tiredness that was worse than anger. He waited. She kept looking at the pasture. "Samuel Harrington," she said, "the client Cobb represents. The man whose name is on half the land deeds east of here." A pause. "That's you?" "Yes," he said, "and Reed. Something I chose on the road." She nodded slowly, like a person confirming something they had already half known and had been hoping was wrong. "The iron banding on the trough," she said quietly. "The way you talk sometimes, the way you watch things." She exhaled. "I thought I was imagining it." "You weren't imagining anything," he said. "You've been reading me correctly from the first day. I've just been giving you incomplete information." She turned to look at him then, and he made himself hold it, the full weight of what was in her eyes. Not rage. Something quieter and more damaging. Disappointment from someone who had not expected to be disappointed. "Why?" she said. Simply that. Because I heard that you'd seen enough of men like me, he said. The kind that arrive with money and leave with whatever they've decided to take. I didn't want to be that to you before you'd had a chance to decide what I actually was. So you lied. Yes. To make me see you clearly. I know how that sounds. It sounds like something a man with good intentions and poor judgment does, she said. Which I suppose is almost worse than bad intentions, because now I don't know what to do with it. She turned back to the pasture. He stayed where he was. The land acquisition, she said after a long moment. This ranch, was it on your list? He hesitated for only a second. It was. She closed her eyes briefly. And now? I had it removed 3 weeks after I arrived here, he said, before I'd even decided to tell you anything. I had Cobb's instructions revised. This property was taken off the acquisition list entirely. He paused. I should have told you that first. The silence that followed was long enough that a pair of swallows crossed the pasture and disappeared into the barn eave before either of them spoke again. I need you to go, she said finally. Not forever. I just need today. All right, he said. He walked back down the road without looking back, which was one of the harder things he had done in recent memory, and that was saying something for a man who had once negotiated a land deal across 3 hostile county lines in February. She came to him 2 days later. He was sitting on the steps of Mrs. Gentry's boarding house in the early evening when she walked up the street. She had her hair down, which he had never seen before. She stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at him with that clear, direct gaze. I'm not forgiving the lie, she said. I want that understood. Understood, he said. But I've been thinking about what you actually did here. Every morning, every fence post, every hour. She paused. A man who wants to take something doesn't fix your water trough with his own money and then not mention it. Samuel said nothing. I'm still angry, she said. You should be, he said. She sat down on the step beside him, not close, but beside him. They watched the street in the cooling evening light. The land acquisition strategy, she said after a while, for the other families here. I've already sent word to dissolve it, he said. All of it. Cobb is being redirected. He looked at her. That's not me trying to earn something. That's just what should have been done a long time ago. She nodded slowly. All right. It did not resolve itself quickly, because real things it rarely do. There were weeks of careful, honest conversations, the kind that are harder than arguments because they require both people to stay present without armor. Selina asked questions, and Samuel answered them without softening the parts that made him look worse. She told him things about her father, about the years of watching this valley slowly pressured from every side, about the particular loneliness of being capable and still feeling like the ground beneath you could shift without warning. He listened in the way he had learned to listen since coming here, without preparing his response while she was still talking. The town had opinions, as towns do. Mrs. Gentry revised hers 3 times in a single week. The boy from the feed shop seemed mostly delighted by the drama. The older ranchers watched Samuel with a new wariness that he accepted without complaint, understanding he had not yet earned their ease and would need to do that slowly. What changed things, eventually, was not a gesture or a speech. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when one of the neighboring ranchers, a man named Everett Glover, whose family had been quietly pressured out of their east pasture 2 years prior, came to Samuel directly and said he had heard the acquisition strategy had been dissolved. He said it plainly, without warmth. Samuel confirmed it, equally plainly, and then said that if Glover wanted, he would have his attorney draw up documentation returning the lease rights on that east pasture to the Glover family at no cost. Glover looked at him for a long time. Then he said he would think about it and walked away. He came back the next morning and said yes. Selina heard about it by afternoon. She didn't say anything to Samuel about it directly. But that evening she brought coffee out to the porch and handed him a cup and sat down beside him in the way that meant something had shifted. Not back to before, because there was no going back to before, but forward into something that had more ground under it. They married the following spring. It was a small ceremony, held at the ranch on a Saturday morning when the pasture was green and the repaired fence line stood straight along the east boundary. Mrs. Gentry cried, which surprised everyone, including herself. The boy from the feed shop attended uninvited and was allowed to stay. Everett Glover came and shook Samuel's hand and said nothing else, which was enough. Selina wore her mother's dress, altered to fit, and she walked out of the house and across the yard and stood beside Samuel in the morning light with the same directness she brought to everything. No hesitation, no performance, just a clear-eyed woman making a considered decision and meaning it completely. Samuel looked at her and thought about the road he had taken to get here, the loose-shoed mare, the false name, the blistered hands, the evening by the fence with the lame calf, all of it, and understood that there was no version of himself he had ever been more certain of than the one standing in this yard right now. The minister said the words. They said theirs back. And somewhere in the territory, in a land office in Dobbs County, a file with the name Harrington Acquisitions, Caldera Falls, sat in a cabinet marked closed, gathering the particular dust of things that had been set right. By the time their first child arrived, a girl, born the following winter with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn silence on mornings before coffee, the town had largely made its peace with who Samuel Harrington was. Not because he had bought that peace, but because he had shown up every day and earned it, one fence post at a time. Selina, for her part, never fully let him forget the lie. He never asked her to. It sat between them not as a wound, but as a reminder of how things had started, of how far they had traveled from that beginning, of the specific and improbable series of choices that had led a man worth a fortune to sit on a porch step in a small, tired town and wait, with genuine uncertainty, to see if a woman who owed him nothing would come back. She had come back. That, Samuel had long since decided, was the only number that had ever mattered.